the joyful naivete of an outdoors evening coupled with the passionate lines preluding to his later works. This is Elgar Serenade for strings coming right up on Conducting Pills. Hi, I'm Gianmaria Griglio, I'm a conductor and a composer, and welcome to Conducting Pills, a series where we take a repertoire piece or a part of it and we analyze it from a conductor's point of view. In this episode, we'll dive into Elgar Serenade for strings, its structure, its phrasing, and of course, we'll have some technical tips. As usual, you can jump through different sections of the video by clicking on the links present in the description below. I want to take a second to thank my new patron Steven, and to remind you that on my Patreon page you can find all the bonus episodes of Conducting Pills, the live sessions, on top of many other patrons' perks. And now, let's start! Published in 1892, the Serenade for Strings is among Elgar's most popular works. It is believed, though, that it was a rework of a suite that Elgar had written years earlier. Elgar was a violinist himself, and speaking of the Serenade much later in life, he wrote to a friend that the work was real stringy in effect. Certainly, despite its brevity, it shows Elgar's mastery of string writing. The Serenade, which suggests something to be played in the evening, is divided in three movements connected by harmonic and motivic elements. The return of the first movement's theme in the last one, for example, something that suggests how Elgar conceived this as one long piece. Let's start with the tempo marking. Allegro Piacevole. Piacevole in itself does not have any meaning of slower or faster. It can be translated as pleasurable or enjoyable. It has the inner idea of something without too much tension, if at all. Now, in turn, this tells you something both about the tempo, which shouldn't be too nervously fast, and the general idea of the movement, which is not overly romantic. Pastoral in style, the movement starts with the violas alone. 2 bars of a rhythmic figure that will accompany us all the way to the end of the serenade. As a conductor, you have more than one decision to make in the first 2 bars. There is a sforzato marking, but there is no dynamic. Is it a sforzato in forte or in mezzo forte? There's also a difference in weight between the sforzato and the accent on the second bar. And here are 3 different ways of conducting the opening. Pim, 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 pim. Second one. Pim, 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 pim. Third one. Pim, 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 pim. The main theme comes in on the 3rd bar, played by the first violins, taken out of the hairpins over 2 bars. And look, 3 bars, and they're interrupted by the violas with the rhythmic motive. The phrase is retaken by the violins, and we move to G major. The violas still insist on the rhythmic motive, this time on the dominant of G. The interesting thing is that 2 notes of that motive become an accompaniment at letter A. 1 bar later, they turn into a 4 bars phrase in the first violins. If you look at it in terms of staccato and legato, this phrase is mirroring the 4 opening bars. And the hairpins we saw in bars 3 and 4, however, span now over 3 full bars. The mood of the beginning returns, underlined by the second half of the theme moving downward and the rhythmic motive. And we apparently come to the end of the first section of the movement. A different chapter opens in G major. But is it really? The violas keep obsessing about the rhythmic figure, while the violins and cellos answer with the legato phrase on top of it. Elgar moves back to E minor for a second, and then resolves into the real new chapter in E major. A very elegant melody is played out by the first violins. And while they take a breath, the second violins now remind us of the rhythmic motive. Moving the line from the violas allows Elgar to manually lift some of the weight, making everything lighter. The descending line of the bridge is now taken by the violas and cellos. Just for a moment. After 2 bars, the serenity of the violin's phrase returns. The same pattern is applied again, but finally the obsession is gone, replaced by a new one actually. The violin's line becomes the model that is passed from section to section in the following passage, moving up. And coming back with the solo violin. The hairpins we saw in the beginning are translated into a longer musical period. The phrase grows and ends up on those two notes we mentioned earlier, followed by a reprise of the rhythmic motif by the violas. And a recapitulation of the first section. Notice how Elgar gives us a reminder of the long lines we've heard in the middle section with the first violin's entrance. The end of the movement is near, but it is delayed by a coda that has all the essence of romanticism, from the dramatic progression to the chromatism of the inner lines. Speaking of which, take special care of the second violins and violas at letter H. The progression ends suspended on the rhythmic motif, and the movement comes to an end, mirroring the end of the first section. And to have the perfect ending, close the legato notes with your left hand while you're giving the downbeat for the pizzicato with your right hand. A simple ABA form for an elegy, this is certainly the most mature of the three movements. It's a prelude to the kind of expressive writing Elgar will use in his symphonies. It begins very simply with a longing line of the first violins, answered by the second violins. The chromatism and the diminished chord enhance the romantic lusciousness of the movement. And there's a surprise right away. 6 bars into the piece and Elgar suddenly increases the temperature with a big crescendo and stringendo. The outburst lands on the dominant, held there by the first violins, while the opening theme moves to the seconds and the violas. On the viola line, the first violins in counterpoint come down an octave and end up on the same suspended G. A very delicate theme is introduced 1 bar later. It's a very long phrase. From bar 17 we go all the way to the end of bar 32. Notice the orchestration. There's no double bass till bar 24. Everyone is playing their mid-low register, creating a warm sound. The melody, rich in jumps of 6 and 7, moves gradually up. By the time the double basses come in, it's in the high register of the violins. Look at how the contrast is created. The weight is increased, but the dynamic is reduced to pianissimo, thinning out in the first violin's line. There are very small crescendos, all going back to pianissimo. The whole atmosphere is quite ethereal, very delicately longing for a resolution that keeps being pushed back. At letter K, we have a new episode. From C major, we jump into A minor and E minor. The second violin's line is the connecting element with the previous part. Everything is still very thin, no cellos or basses, violas and first violins in the mid-high register, second violins answering by themselves. We end up on a rhythmic melodic figure that was so dear to Wagner. And that will take us back to the A section of the movement. The air is still very thin. The line progresses up but folds back on itself in a constant diminuendo to a triple piano. The last section of the movement, starting at letter L, begins with the second theme we heard in the first section. with some variations in the orchestration now much more active. First violins in octaves, cellos divisi, and second violins and violas with turmoiled triplets. But notice that the dynamic remains triple piano until bar 55. The luscious romantic sound is achieved by the doubling of the melody in the first cellos. The movement peaks briefly and then starts going back, retreating to a piano and pianissimo dynamics. A final appearance of the very first theme leads to a peaceful end. By the way, the bonus episode of this week will be entirely dedicated on how to conduct this second movement. The Allegretto is quite a brief movement. It sets the tone in G major with a pastoral-like rhythm in the melodic lines. The viola entrance at bar 4 has a seemingly more heroic character, but in fact, everything remains in a very relaxed atmosphere for the entire movement. This thematic idea forms the backbone of the first part of this last movement, passed around from section to section, until the introductory bars come back on measure 32, closing the circle of the first part. Then, the surprise. The idea of closing the circle enlarges to the whole serenade. The rhythmic figure of the first movement is back in the second violins. We briefly hear the long lines of the violins, again from the first movement. And we come to the coda, built once more on the rhythmic motive. Finally, the piece comes to an end in a serene E major in pianissimo, completing the circle. Elgar Serenade is the music of youth, filled with vitality and naive tenderness. By definition, the title Serenade reminds of something nocturnal, played outdoors in nature. If you want to be Shakespearean, it can remind you, of course, of Romeo and Juliet and of a ballad sung to a woman in the moonlight. It's a magical walk at night, and like a dream, it magically disappears. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button right below the video and ring the bell so you will get notified every time a new video comes out. You can also show your support on Patreon, and if you're interested in conducting technique, join my Facebook group. You'll find all the links in the description. Let me know in the comments what you think about this piece and if you have any suggestions for future videos, and I will see you next week with the new episode of Conducting Pills when we will go through the rest of Mozart's Symphony No. 40. Till then, bye-bye. Register the triplet, moving outward and upward, then stay there and make sure that the downbeat of the tempo remain all the way up here without making a diminuendo, except for the violas. The accent on the second beat of bar 30.